and welcome to another episode of the Never Ending Experiment. Today, I want to talk about self tests and self awareness. So, I have had a number of call center jobs in my past. I worked on a transportation study, I worked in a call center doing surveys. I also took surveys for a while online, and it taught me quite a bit about asking questions and how we measure human psychology. In psychology, of course, most of the psychological and psychiatric diagnoses that they give people come from self tests. So even if you're asking someone the questions, the self test essentially means that they are deciding for themselves what they are or who they are. You're not measuring them doing a specific task, for example. Now, we use this kind of testing a lot in today's world, and I think there are huge limitations to it. But there are also situations where I think that we can't do without it. I think the biggest one that this kind of self-testing is really important is when working with certain kinds of medicine that are only measurable subjectively. Like pain tolerance is an example of something that's very, very subjective. There's no real way to test pain tolerance other than someone reacting to pain and telling you that it's painful. Like there's not really a lot of other ways to fully determine what that means. Also, depression and certain psychological illnesses, like there is, I think, a very important role for subjective testing when you're dealing with, do I feel good or do I feel bad? Because it's a completely subjective question. So we sort of need those kind of questions in those sort of situations. But I think what's happened today is that they have extrapolated this kind of testing onto all kinds of other things, especially when you look at psychological diagnoses. Having a biological diagnosis for an illness usually requires taking certain testing, and it's biological testing. So there's no way of feeling it out. It's usually physically obvious what's going on. And I think that the problem is they do treat the self-testing as though it's objective. And this happens in all psychology and social sciences. And I think it's a big reason why it's very difficult to repeat any of the studies that are done in psychology and sociology, because human behavior is just so changeable. And it's true that we change our behavior when we know we're being tested and we're not being tested. There are all kinds of psychological tests that they do now where they basically lie to the people who are taking the test. So they come into it not really knowing what they're going to be tested on, how they're going to be tested. Often they're told they're testing them for one thing, but it's actually something else. Now, there's a certain element, I think, of ethical consideration that goes into that. But it shows you how aware we are of how easily biased we are and how easily influenced we are by many different things, which should kind of be a clue to why it is so limiting to even use these kind of tests at all. I think there's going to come to a point where they sort of realize that those kind of psychological tests don't really contribute that much, other than we already know for sure that people are easily influenced by ideas. We already have the placebo effect that's well known, which is why virtually all of the medical testing they do involves a control group to see if the influence is psychological. So we know that psychology has a big influence. So it's clear that we do need this subjective self-testing when it comes to certain things that can only be tested subjectively. But what does it mean when we start stepping outside of that? And what I found really interesting is the lack of testing that we have for psychological traits that we often talk about, that we only rely on self-testing for, whether it's autism or depression or introversion, the Myers-Briggs tests, Enneagram tests. All of those tests rely on you to know exactly how you are, often in situations with other people or objects or whatever it is. And the fact is, a lot of people really don't have good self-awareness. What I would like to see more of is the kind of tests where they ask other people around you about your traits and then see how much that matches up with your self-perception of your own traits. I know they've done some of that with gender, and often there are differences in how men and women perceive themselves based on their gendered stereotype. So they will try to describe themselves more as what they expect the gender stereotype to be, even if their behavior doesn't actually match that. And the same thing is with other types of traits. What I found so amazing is people who call themselves introverts, who are extremely outgoing, or people who are quiet, who aren't necessarily introverted in the sense that, the way introverts and extroverts are described. When we meet someone and we might call them introverted or extroverted, but what if they don't feel that way? Because when you really look into the description of what those things mean, introverts and extroverts, it means how you feel like you gain energy. So some people feel more energetic and engaged when other people are around, and other people feel more energetic and engaged when they spend more alone time. But the problem with that is then introversion and extroversion are measured totally internally and subjectively, so they don't actually relate to being outgoing or shy. That actually the outgoingness and the shyness are totally separate attributes that are measured with how you interact with other people and don't have anything to do with how you energize, which is quite an elaborate theory. And we have a lot of really elaborate theories in psychology, and a lot of them are developed out of observations that they make with people, but a lot of times those theories are wrong. There's issues like when people want attention. They'll say, oh, so-and-so just wants attention if they do something out of the ordinary. But a lot of people do things out of the ordinary for totally different reasons. A lot of people don't consider it to be interesting to conform, and so they just want to do it because it would make their life more interesting. Some people are easily bored. It doesn't have anything to do with other people's attention. And you can see that pretty clearly when those people do things when they're totally alone and not with other people. So they may actually be pushing the boundaries a lot more when they're on their own. We saw that during the pandemic. Nobody would change their hair color, for example, to get attention from other people when all they're doing is spending their time alone. And so they're actually more likely to take risks and do different things precisely because they don't have to face the judgment of other people. But then other people will determine that they've done that because they're wanting attention. So we constantly make these assumptions about other people's behavior and about their psychological state from the outside, which are actually very, very different than how those people perceive themselves from the inside. And I think that's why virtually most of psychology is not scientific and not valid, because it relies on either totally internal just judgments on yourself and who you are, and then sometimes it also relies on external explanations for those internal judgments. But sometimes both of those things are wrong, the internal judgment and the external interpretation. So it's very convoluted, and I think it's problematic because there is so much psychology today, and they're using psychology for all kinds of different things, and they're using tests that aren't necessarily based on objective truth. It's something like conscientiousness. I think that's one of the biggest ones that makes me really more skeptical of psychology, because people talk about that attribute like it's measurable and it's solid and it's part of your natural makeup. And I simply don't believe that. When you really break down different types of human behaviors and different types of feelings, you really need to simplify it if you want to make it scientific. And conscientiousness is not simple. So therefore, you cannot test it using a scientific method. You would need to get down deep into the separate components of what that means. And I see the same thing happening with autism, where there are so many different symptoms of autism, and the diagnosis for this has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and changed dramatically over the last 40, 50 years. In the past, autism was something really, really obvious. And now people behave totally normally and they call themselves autistic. So something has changed dramatically to lead us to this. And I think part of it is the idea that they want to categorize different traits that might happen together as though they are one type of syndrome when really they're just a bunch of different traits. So I think people need to be a little more wary of categorizing themselves or diagnosing themselves based purely on how they perceive their own behavior. Because the fact is, we don't always see ourselves clearly. And I think this is something that needs to be looked at a little bit more. Because when you realize that maybe how you think you do things isn't actually how you do it, it can change your self perception a lot. And we have so many self tests now. Some of them are really, really silly, like online, like BuzzFeed, or like they'll have like, which character are you from this show? And we tend to think of those as sort of silly and meaningless compared to some of the psychiatric tests, but actually they're very similar because they're just based on observations and someone's put together an idea of how they think different people are. But when you really get into it, you see that so many people have categorized different personalities in many, many different ways. And you could come out like this type or that type. And I think younger people get into it more. I know I was definitely more into that when I was younger. And I think it's because you're kind of searching for your identity and searching for who you are and like how you fit into the world. And it can be quite interesting to look at those, but there's always a big but at the end. There's always something that's like, well, you could change, and also it can be perceived differently. Like I said, with introversion and extroversion, those aren't real personality attributes that can be measured equally from the outside and from the inside, because you would be measuring different things. And so I think you kind of have to look at all of those diagnoses in a similar way. If you have not received a physical test, for example, showing you that something's different about your brain or the neurochemicals in your body, if you have not had a physical test showing you that objectively, you can't really claim that that's what's going on with you. And I think we have come into a place where people are being taught to call themselves this or that, especially using mental illness categories, but they've never really been objectively tested because it is all still subjective self-perception. And I think we're entering into this age now where a lot of our social awkwardness is being framed as a mental illness or a concern. I mean, I think some people are realizing, oh, wait, like these things are so normal. Why are we calling them diseases if everybody has it and it's so common and getting more and more common? And I think part of it is that we're not really looking at how we have changed our environment so much that inevitably, of course, our behavior will change. But I think that, especially having a neurological, like a measurable neurological issue with an identified genetic mutation and with so much testing that's very, very physical, there's really virtually none of it is self-testing. It's all objective testing. To hear people call themselves neurodivergent is kind of like you're kind of giving a false impression of what neurology is because you're looking at the complex behaviors that mix up a lot of your traits rather than understanding that those are traits and they may be neurological, maybe they're not. If we consider every single part of human behavior to be neurological, then every single thing that we do is neurological. But that gives a very false impression of what a genuine neurological disease is, which can be measured. And often it could be a brain scan or nerve testing. I've had tons of different nerve testings. I've been through all of the testing, all of the physical testing since I was a child. So I find it very disappointing because we're using the same words, but they don't have the same meaning. And I think that it's created this whole new world of disabilities that are not necessarily based on the ability to do anything physical, So there is no physical component. It's only complex behaviors that are being measured. And I'm not saying that there's no physiological aspect to it, because everything has a physiological aspect to it. But if you're not measuring someone physiologically, then you can't objectively say that they have a physical illness. They have something going on, but until you actually find out what it is, you can't necessarily diagnose it properly. So I think we have a lot of false diagnoses going on, and we're simplifying things that are complex, not just human behavior, but medicine. Medicine is really, really complex, and I think what's happened is there's been this big push to raise awareness for different diseases when that's the job of a doctor. Like, there are so many diseases. I don't think people, like regular people, understand how specialized your knowledge has to be to really get your head around what those mean. And doctors are trained to go through a process of elimination to figure out what could be going on. And regular people don't have that knowledge. One thing that has stood out to me with medicine is that virtually every major disease has at least one symptom in common with a panic attack. So if you're worried about your health and you start looking up these different diseases and you start panicking, you're going to really think that you have some kind of disease, because that's what it feels like. So our awareness of that, I think, is just very limited, and it concerns me, the belief in psychological testing and diagnoses. Again, when it is completely subjective, that you're saying, I'm very conscientious. Like, I don't believe an individual person can actually measure their own conscientiousness, and I don't think conscientiousness can even really be measured scientifically. If you were to ask people, is this person conscientious that you know in your life? And then you ask the person, I think often we will probably come up with very different answers because of how people want to see themselves. Or if they have low self-esteem, then they will falsely describe themselves in a more negative way. And I see that happening a lot too, with a lot of self-sabotage, where people really don't believe in themselves and don't perceive themselves correctly. Now, this is something I've observed with virtually everybody that I know, and I would not be surprised if I've done it too. And I think that's why I did try to test myself so much, but in the end I realized I'm still just testing my self-perception. I'm not actually testing my personality. And what is a personality? Personalities are very, very complicated, and they definitely change with time, because once you become more aware of certain things, you may even change your behavior a bit in order to accommodate either a deficit in your personality or an excess, or just how you want to behave in order to get certain things to happen. So I wish that people would just kind of back away from that a bit. For the people in psychology, I'm just wondering, like, what direction would you have to take to start really, really looking at both the internal state of a person and the external state of a person? Psychologists have been tested many, many, many times to see who they think is mentally ill, and they virtually always will diagnose everyone as mentally ill, like everyone. So what is that saying? If everyone is mentally ill, how can we ever determine what mental health is? And how can we determine how people even know whether or not they're mentally ill? Because mostly how we describe what mental illness is when you don't feel good. Depression is a state of extreme sadness. And we've even come to this place where we describe different kinds of depression differently, whether or not you've gone to a doctor to tell them about it, and they've also agreed with you that you're actually depressed, which to me is really, like, that's crazy. If depression is a pretty simple feeling, and I think, the difference between depression and autism is significant, because depression, I think, is very easy to determine because it's a feeling, and it's a pretty simple feeling. It's just the feeling of extreme sadness, which many of us go through. And I think that when it persists, that's when it becomes sort of more serious. But is that clinical depression? Does it matter that you've been diagnosed as depressed? Because most doctors will simply go along with what you want, because they want you to feel better, And the fact is, they simply don't know what's going on with you, especially when it comes to mental illness and psychological issues. There's too much complexity, there's too much overlap in all of these different issues. And I think what a lot of it comes down to is a reaction to things that happen in their life. Some of them might be normal things that happen and they react in a certain way that can make things worse, unfortunately. But some of it, I think, is coming from the fact that we live such an unnatural lifestyle. And so we have created a very depressing environment for people. So it shouldn't be surprising that people get depressed. And then we have also created a lot of anxiety producing situations now where social situations are deemed to be more and more anxiety provoking. And people are going out of their way to create these environments that aren't going to make people anxious. But the fact is, if you live in a capitalist economy where your whole survival depends on getting a job, and when unemployment is out of control and you need to make money and you can't, of course you're going to get anxious. And if you've been working at a job where you have to change your personality, especially if you are someone who has done a lot of work to try to figure out who you are and what your personality is, and then you go into the workplace and they don't care at all. They just want you to fit in and get the job done, and that's it. And they don't care about your personality. So we have people that are overly focused on this kind of thing, and then people also who don't care at all about it. And the clash between those ideologies right now and those systems of thought, I think, is really, really big. And I think that you need to kind of get out of your little bubble. And the internet is definitely contributing to this bubble in a serious way. We've known about this for over a decade. It's not an AI issue. This is something pre-AI that's been going on for a long time. I mean, we've been living under algorithms now for over a decade, right? So our whole lives, when we go online and we try to engage in whatever it is online, and so many businesses are only on there, and we have to interact with that system in a way that makes sense. Meanwhile, when you go on there, you're fed all of this information about psychology. Not only that, but the algorithm is tailored to your psychology as well. I go on some of these social media sites and see all of these organizations that I know the owners of those social media sites would not approve of. And I'm wondering, am I being radicalized by all of these different sites that are clearly catered to a specific stereotype and a specific type of person? So that makes it even more complicated, is that then you're giving these self-tests to describe yourself so that you can be stereotyped even more. And that then the entire internet experience will cater to you being a specific way. And now that AI is being used in other contexts, that could be happening offline as well. So not only are people being fed information about psychology that isn't really true and doing tests that aren't really accurate to who they are, because the fact is, to be really self-aware in a social context, you absolutely require the input of other people, because that's what socializing is. You can't do that on your own. You can't figure that out on your own. So introspection about yourself and who you are doesn't really fit in with you figuring out who you are in a social context. But that's usually what those introspective tools do, is measuring how you are socializing, and then it just sort of self-reinforces all the time. You do the test to ask how introverted you are. It says, how much do you like going to parties, for example? And if you say that you don't like it that very much, that's another point for introversion. And then they'll come out and say, did you know that introverts prefer not to go to parties? But it's like, but that was the question in the test to see if you were introverted. So it's self-reinforcing. It doesn't show you a fact. It shows you just the description of what that word is. And that brings us to the whole complicated mess of determining what these different abstract words mean and what the human behavior words mean and what the descriptions of different personalities mean when they get more and more complex. That's why I think conscientious is a big one to understand, because you cannot measure a simple behavior and label it conscientious or not, because so much of what your behavior revolves around is your knowledge of what it is you're doing. If you're recycling all the time, for example, like that's considered to be a very good thing. But what if you find out that the recycling is actually going to an incinerator and it's not being recycled at all? And so you stop recycling, maybe you do something else with it. But then if you were to measure conscientiousness based on people recycling, then you would determine that this person isn't conscientious, but actually they just have knowledge that you don't have that has made them behave differently. So most of psychology relies on really simple things like that to make measurements about complex behaviors and personality traits. And I think people need to get really, really skeptical about that kind of thing. You need to allow yourself the freedom to grow and change and be who you are, which isn't a solid thing. That's another thing that's contested is like, who are you really? Because some people will say, I want to be my authentic self. But what is authentic? Can you be your authentic self at home alone? Do you need to be around other people to be your authentic self? Depends on how you define your authentic self. And I think it's true that sometimes we're doing things that feel more natural, that feel better, that feel like, yeah, this is what I like doing. When I listen to people talk about plants and I get into that world, I get very, very calm. I get very, very at ease, And other subjects I talk about, even if I'm very interested in them, and they start to put me on edge, they start to make me uneasy. If we start talking about religion, I'll get really upset because I see all of these flaws and all of these problems. Other people will go to religion and feel that same sense of peace and awe because they're not looking at the problems. They're looking only at how they feel, and religion is one of those things too that's so, so subjective. And the reasoning behind why people cling to it are often emotional, but when you get into it, some of those religions become very, very judgmental. And a lot of those religious groups have developed their own psychological system and analysis because they're not living in a bubble either. They're hearing about science, they're hearing about psychology, and a lot of them are trying to integrate these sort of different ways of thinking together and coming up with very, very bizarre ideologies as well. Like I remember one of these was like a man's man or a God's man or a woman's man, right, for Christians. And it's like if you're the best kind of man, you're God's man. If you're an okay man, you're a man's man. But the worst kind of man is a woman's man, according to this Christian. You can imagine Jesus laughing at that. Like, that's totally ridiculous. But I guess what I'm saying is that it's very subjective how we categorize people. And most of the people that make these categories are doing that also from a subjective perspective. So they're looking at the people they know and how they categorize them. It's like the statement, there are only two kinds of people. Well, I've heard the only two kinds of people are the people who think there are two kinds of people and the people who don't think there are two kinds of people. Or what about surveys? I was talking about how I've done surveys a lot too. And the fact is, all surveys are skewed away from people who hate doing surveys. Some people simply don't like doing surveys. So their opinions are never included in any survey. And that may seem trivial, but it does flaw the entire system. So you can only measure one survey against the exact same survey in a different time and place. And even that gets contentious, of course, because when you translate it into a different language, it can take on different meaning. So cross-cultural surveys also can become very challenging. And the people that word these take it very seriously, which is good because it is very challenging. But the fact is that language changes. So you may need actually a very different survey for someone who's 20 and someone who's 70 because there's been so many subtle changes in the way that we use language that people aren't even perceiving it the same way. And I think the biggest concern about these kind of self-tests is market research and how much they use it in marketing, advertising, and business. And there's a lot of work put into the psychology of business and trying to cater to specific groups. And this has been one of the most disastrous things for the environmental movement because people know, these business people know, that there are people that want environmental products and they want to do the best thing ecologically. And so there's been so much greenwashing and tinkering with how things are produced, how they're named. Just using green font on a product will make people think that it's environmentally friendly. You put a little leaf on there, and it may not have anything to do with environmentalism at all. But that's how we've kind of been brainwashed into thinking, is because they will kind of go out of their way. Like, you could even print on a plastic package something that looks like brown paper, and people will then perceive that as ecologically friendly, even though it's completely fake. And that's the diabolical side of it all, is when you have people with a lot of power purposefully tricking a lot of people into believing something. Now, because I have always been a critical thinker and I've always questioned since I was 11 years old, it's not that I don't get tricked. I'm sure I get tricked all the time. It's just that I'm more aware of it, so it wears on me. And I feel like for some people who don't perceive it must be living in bliss, because they're just going along with it and they don't even notice. I've seen podcasts recently that I didn't even know existed, because the algorithms have slotted me into being a stereotype, probably based on these kind of self-tests. And you think about it too, every time a social media site or any site asks you if you liked this ad or that ad, they're feeding that. They have simplified complexity to the point where it is no longer complex, where everything has been simplified and it's just chaos. It's not complexity anymore, because we haven't understood the holistic way to integrate everything together. So it's just scattered in all directions. So I think a little bit of skepticism is needed for most people who are analyzing their personality and want to know more about it. And maybe do some of those stupid online tests telling you what character you are from a different show, just to show you how easy it is to make up those tests. And it should be fun, it should be interesting, but like, take it with a grain of salt. You know, we can all change. Our personalities can change dramatically from one situation to another. And I'm sure different people that have seen me in different situations would describe me very differently, because I've been in a different state of mind. You know, you could watch the same exact thing and feel one way about it one day, watch it another day and feel completely differently. So our feelings, our personalities are all complex, and I think we need to allow them to be complex and quit trying to simplify them to the point where we've turned into these cardboard stereotypes, just consuming really, really narrow levels of media just because that's the simplest thing for the overlords. So thanks for your time. It's been another episode of the Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson, and I'll see you again in a couple weeks.